County Historic Tavern Trail to our Halloween installment. Last year we did the history of ghost storytelling in Dutchess County. We started with back in the early 19th century, the first couple of decades of the 1800s. People did newspaper articles and other publications that basically made fun of everyone who believed in ghosts. Then we took it forward through the various eras, the spiritualism of the late 19th century, early 20th century, so seances, all of that stuff. The beginning of modern paranormal studies, which is now a historical phenomenon, even if one might debate whether or not it's a scientific phenomenon. All the way up to more or less the present. So then the challenge became, all right, what next? Because every year I'm like, are we going to do this again? I guess so. So I was advised that what everyone wants to hear are ghost stories. We'll get to that in a second because we're going to do a little bit of warm-up with something that I like to call Prohibition humor. So these are Prohibition jokes from the Rhinebeck Gazette, published here in the village of Rhinebeck from the late 19th century through the middle of the 20th century. So our first joke tonight, waiter comes in and says, "There's a lady out here who says that her husband promised he would come in early tonight, not stay out late at the bar." And the punchline is, every man in the room stands up and says, "I'll be right back." Ta-da. Yeah, you thought dad humor was bad. Guess what? It gets worse, but it's history, so that makes it sort of okay. And there's the little excerpt from the paper so that you know I'm not making it up myself. I'm happy to provide sources afterwards. Our next joke, let's see if this one lands any better. So Rule, he asks his buddy, did you say Peggy's old man is a plasterer? And his buddy Hosmer says, yeah, he's a bartender in a speakeasy. Oh, okay, now we see what plays. And yes, there, see, not writing these myself, I wish I had that level of wit. Now, I'm sure most of us have had that experience of a relative visiting from out of town, from a simpler place, say, randomly, I'm just going to say maybe Nebraska, and they're not quite clued into everything going on the East Coast, especially in the 1930s. So this is our last one. Young couple is, they've got an aunt who's come in from Nebraska. She's a little bit absent-minded. She's a little bit innocent. Conversation turns towards speakeasies, of which, of course, New York has an enormous amount during Prohibition. The aunt hears it. She perks up, and she says, "Oh, speakeasies, yes, please. I've heard so much about them. Can we visit one? I think they're going to be so much better than the silent movies." Yeah, that's what I like. So you're all warmed up. We've given the late folks a little bit of time to get here. So, and there's the documentation. Into this we jump. So, as you know, I am the Dutchess County historian, which means when we start to talk about ghost stories, I have to throw a few provisos, provisions, a little teeny smattering of education, because technically that's what I'm paid to do. And what the topic of ghost stories brings, to my mind at least, is this dividing line between history and folklore. Because I'm sure everyone more or less has heard some version of the joke that, you know, these battles in academia and universities are so rough and so harsh because the resources are so low. Well, those battles are not just in academia. They are also between the various disciplines out in the cultural sector. So historians, folklorists have had some disagreements, let us say, about how one examines the past. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of February 14th, 1930. So the more famous Chicago version of this happens in 1929. All the gangsters look at that and say, you know, that's a really cool idea because people like to party for Valentine's Day, and it gives us an opportunity to discuss our feelings and our disagreements in a collaborative and productive fashion. So on the evening of February 14th, 1930, gathered roughly in this area are the friends and associates of Lucky Luciano, who is one of the leading gangsters down in New York City. They're going to have a party. Lucky's supposed to have a drinking game between all of his girlfriends to see which one actually ends up on top that night. And the evening is going to conclude, it's going to climax with a champagne toast. But when the waiters come in, instead of big, plates full of champagne glasses, they have Thompson submachine guns. They are friends of one of Lucky Luciano's business competitors, Legs Diamond. And they end up shooting everyone in the room and then departing. Lucky Luciano had not arrived on time, so managed to avoid being snuffed. Now, as a result, generations of restaurant staff here have said that every now and again you'll hear sounds of parties down here, clinking of glasses, voices raised in conversation and song. Sometimes around February you will hear sounds of extreme violence coming out of this area. So, one thing to bear in mind. Now, another example is something that's happened up at the Elmendorf Inn up in Red Hook. By sheer coincidence, it's where my wife, the executive director of historic Red Hook, Elizabeth Tatum, works. And yes, the Red Hook faction is strong. So we're still putting together the history of the Elmendorf Inn. We know that it's probably constructed around 1750, 1760. The further you go back in time, the broader the year range is that we are happy to tolerate. By the time you get back to the Middle Ages, it's like plus or minus 1,000 years. That's okay. But 18th century plus or minus 10 years. The top view there is the Elmendorf as it looked when it was initially preserved. And this is the version of it you will see today. So looking back at the early records associated with Elmendorf, we run across this guy called George Sharp. He's running the business there, which is a tavern, between 1773 and 1778. That's all well, cool, and good, right? Well, fast forward to 2014, 2015, when Historic Red Hook brings in a paranormal research group to do electronic voice phenomenon. So they do recordings in the basement. They do recordings on the main floor, on the second floor. They pick up all sorts of weird stuff, one of which seems to be a communication from a man identifying himself as George. And we can link that to a fellow that we actually have in that historical record. Fast forward a couple of more years to 2019, Historic Red Hook hosted a Living History Day. Now, this is the sort of thing we could do before COVID that hasn't quite come back since then. You've got basically costumed interpreters and the clothing of the early 19th century or the late 18th century, doing a variety of activities that would have occurred at this site back during that time. All day long, these reenactors are there, they're doing their thing, their period styling and whatnot, and then predictably, towards the end, everyone leaves except for one person. That person is left to clean up the inn by themselves. And as they're sitting inside the fully locked inn, first thing they hear are footsteps up on the second floor. And these are not the footsteps of modern synthetic heels on hardwood. These are the footsteps of hard, leather-soled shoes on hardwood, walking back and forth on the second floor, where there at least aren't any living people. They aren't supposed to be up there. And then as this person is pondering the experience and looking at the back door to the Elmendorf, which opens out onto Cherry Street, there comes a loud on the door. The problem being there's a window right next to that door, and for anyone to approach it to knock on it, they would have had to pass by that window. Needless to say, this individual did not spend too much more time at the site, turned off the lights, left. Now, one of the issues, as I alluded to, is that empiricism goes a little bit out the window, and to let you know, give you a little bit of insight into how I feel about this, one of those two stories is a complete fabrication, and the other's only a partial fabrication. Do we have any votes for the massacre being a fabrication? By show of hands. All right. And how many folks think that the Elmendorf story is a fabrication? Same people cannot vote twice. Well, yes, as it turns out, that massacre story is complete and utter fabrication, but it was super cool, wasn't it? The Elmendorf story, on the other hand, I was the guy who was left alone in that building. Yeah. And as I was telling a few of our attendees before the program started, I've been in and out of historic structures, ranging from taverns and houses to hospitals. I've been on battlefields, overnights where no public are around, seemingly the perfect setting for paranormal phenomenon. And I only have like half a dozen stories, not like the 30 or 40 that would really help to flesh out this evening. Now, if you read the promo for this program, you would have seen me making references to, I'm going to comb through the county histories, especially the county history by James Smith, published in 1882, which James Smith's idea of doing history, and I grant you it would be a little bit easier than the way I do history, was to find the oldest person he could in every town and hamlet and say, hey, what happened here back in the olden times, and write it down. So there is a rumor that a lot of crazy stories ended up in there. Now, when I went over it with a fine-tooth comb, there weren't any ghost stories. There weren't any witch stories. There weren't any monster stories. I was beginning to think that, you know, there's a reason that Lewis C. Jones told the Dutchess County Historical Society that maybe they needed to let their hair down a little bit, because old Dutchess was so prim and proper. If anything weird happened, no one wrote it down. And as a historian, I'm a little dependent on people writing things down. But there's good news. And here's the guy who was responsible for it, Henry D.B. Bailey. So he was born in the early 19th century in the greater Fishkill area, grew up there, wrote for the Fishkill Telegraph, he wrote for the Poughkeepsie Journal, the Fishkill Standard, and the Poughkeepsie Telegraph. Names change over time, crazy stuff. So he was a local columnist that wrote about weird stuff that he had heard from his parents, from his great-grandparents, because when you are born in 1813, you know, living memory goes way far back, well before the American Revolution in this case. And happily for us, he wrote the book whose title is up here at the top of the screen, Local Tales and Historical Sketches, published in 1874. I wish someone in Rhinebeck had gotten on that train, because he preserved a variety of interesting stories. We're going to go through just a couple of them tonight, because odds are I will have to do this again next year, so I don't want to give away all of the cool stories in just one fell swoop. But you can actually find his book online. You can download it as a PDF from the Library of Congress. Because Dutchess County is so important, the Library of Congress has digitized large numbers of our old history works. So it's a good county to be historian of. So our first tale tonight, and this is a modernized version. Yes, this is a photo of a structure from Piscataway, Maryland, because unfortunately a photo of the structure that is the basis for this tale is not currently available. We'll get into that. So Henry Bailey's writing in the 19th century. He publishes in 1874, but that means he has written it before 1874. Anyone who's published anything knows the publishers like to draw that timeline out between the manuscript and the printing. So he writes like someone who was born in 1813. It would be kind of like standing up here reading Charlotte Bronte to you all, which if that's your jam, I can definitely do that. But I have modernized these stories just a bit for you. The main corpus of knowledge, as he lays it out, is in there. It's just 21st century speech patterns rather than 1860s speech patterns. So East Fishkill, the town that we know today, is actually established in 1849. When we turn the clock back to the very beginnings of settlement in Dutchess County, that's in the late 1680s. What is currently East Fishkill is part of what is then the Rombouten Patent, because Dutchess County is basically settled as a real estate pyramid scheme. with, yes, you laugh, and it's funny because it's true. You have New York City-based investors who come up and make outrageous deals with the indigenous inhabitants. Rombout Patent is named after Francis Rombout and Julian, or Julian, depending on your version of Dutch, Verplank, who send their representatives up, meet with the Wapachers, and purchase 85,000 acres. And working in the county clerk's office, my first question is, who did that survey? Because that's a whole lot of meets and bounds. So, Rombout Precinct is established in 1685. Rich investors down in New York City, they divide these huge patents up into basically rental lots. So most of southern Dutchess County, parts of where we are today actually, was part of one of these several Beekman patents. It ends up dividing into farm plots. Each of these plots is rented out. Now, as the population grows, the need for a place to hang out, to do business, to perhaps enjoy some adult beverages away from the kids. The need for that grows. So early on in the 18th century, a tavern is established in what is now East Fishkill to serve these needs. Now, the tavern keeper, whose name is lost to history, conveniently, he decides that he really wants to maximize his income stream because you just really can't have enough money in 18th century Dutchess County. So he comes up with several excellent ideas of, let's say, negotiable legality. First, he's going to encourage gambling at his establishment. It's going to be cards, it's going to be dice, don't laugh at this, it's going to be shuffleboard. They actually name in all of the licensing laws, no shuffleboard, not allowed at taverns, terrible thing. And he's going to have horse racing. And of course, everyone who comes to the tavern to do these things, he's going to get a cut from that. And he's slowly but surely accumulating a nice pile of gold and silver coins. In fact, when he is caught unawares by visitors, it's kind of like a Scrooge McDuck moment for those of us who remember that character who had a vault full of gold coins that he would go swimming in, except in this case, the tavern keeper would be found poring over a table filled with Spanish doubloons, Dutch Johannas, English crowns, just piles of gold and silver. But his visible estate, his means of living never seemed to dramatically increase. He didn't put additions onto the tavern. He didn't build any other outbuildings. He didn't dress differently. He didn't eat differently. He just seemed to really like the idea of having, according to local rumor, big piles of money. And that local rumor said, well, since he's not spending it, and since he doesn't have a money vault that we can see, he must be burying it in the cellar. Because cellars in the 18th century in Dutchess County, unfinished structures. Very easy to just dig into the wall, hide your packet of coins, close it up, you're good to go. However, local rumor also states that, well, the proceeds from all the gambling and the drinking and everything else aren't quite enough to fund this man's avarice. So what else is he going to do to diversify his revenue stream? Rumors begin to circulate, lots of rumors in early Dutchess County, that travelers are disappearing in this area of Dutchess County. Because bear in mind, roads in that period were not frequently encountered. When they were really more like paths than roads outside of the post road, which is modern Route 9. So all of your travel is by foot or by horseback, which means most of it is by foot because horses are very expensive, kind of like the Mercedes-Benzes of the period. So if you're traveling and it starts to get nighttime, you're going to be looking for an establishment, a house, a bungalow, anything you can get really, to stay in overnight. And there are always people moving around. So when people stay with this tavern keeper who have family or acquaintances or friends in the area, they have no problem at all. They go to sleep, they wake up, they eat, they drink, they leave, they go on their way. But they observe that there's a special suite of rooms in the building that the tavern keeper, the landlord as he would have been known in this time, never puts them in. Those are always reserved for the out-of-town folks. The ones who well, were they here? Were they not? No one's really keeping tabs. And the rumor begins to grow that these out-of-towners are brought in. He welcomes them into the house. He feeds them. He drinks with them. He, asks them leading questions like, does anyone know where you're going? Is anyone expecting you? Et cetera, et cetera. How much gold and silver do you have in your pockets? Could you give me an itemized list of your valuables? Very non-leading things like that. And then they strangely disappear in these back rooms. So the idea springs up in the locality that, well, maybe he tortures them for their valuables, kills them. Where's he going to put the body? Ah, yes, in the cellar with the gold. So this situation goes on for some time. There is a little bit of local notice that is raised when a peddler goes missing, because at this point in time, peddlers are like the Amazon.com of 18th century America, really. They show up with all sorts of stuff that you might need, like scissors, and sell it to you and then go on your way. So memorable, and people noticed that there was a peddler around, but then the peddler disappeared and no one really saw him go, but we did see him go to this tavern. Very suspicious stuff. However, there's never any intercession, any visits by what passed for law enforcement to look into this guy's operations. So the landlord just keeps on keeping on until he finally passes away some years later. And then the property becomes vacant for a while. And of course, this is when weird stuff starts to be reported locally. So people who are passing by the property at dusk or near dawn when it's dark enough are noticing that there are lights inside, like candle lights. That's what they had back then. So they creep up to the windows, they look inside, and they see the shade, the ghost of the tavern keeper bent over his table looking at his ghost money, this big pile of gold and silver coins. So of course the rumor begins to spread that there is a treasure here being guarded by the ghost of the guy who put it together. Now most of the people give this area wide berth because full body apparitions, Scrooge McDucking, piles of ghost money is not really something that anyone in the 18th century wants to get involved with. It also doesn't help that there are rumors of the sounds of wagons and coaches and other vehicles that echo through the nearby woods, but there are no vehicles passing by. It's altogether a very supernaturally sketchy situation. This dissuades everyone except for two buddies named Payne and Squires. They are casual agricultural laborers, so they go from farm to farm in the area, providing whatever labor is necessary, and then drinking up the proceeds at the local tavern. They, of course, hear about all of these stories of the ghost with all the gold. It comes into their minds that, maybe the ghost gold is good enough for the ghost, and we can take the real gold, and that would make our lives much easier. He's not going to mind. Easy, easy. So they gather a shovel, a spade, a pickaxe, an iron candlestick. Iron is supposed to be good proof against ghosts, and a candle. And one night, in the wee hours of the morning, when it's pitch black, they make their way to this abandoned tavern. They open the window, very easily make their way in, sort of bump their way across the tap room, which is where, as upstairs, you would serve alcohol and food. Find those narrow stairs that go down to the basement, to the cellar, light their candle down there, and then they proceed to dig. And they dig, and they dig. Nothing's coming up. But at one point, Squires stops. And he looks up, he cocks his head to the side, and he listens. And then his buddy Payne realizes that he's suddenly the only one working, which is not really their agreed upon arrangement. So he stops and he looks at Squires, and Squires looks at him and says, "Do you hear that?" And just before Payne is about to say no, get back to work, footsteps begin to sound on the floorboards above them. Now, when they entered the tavern, it wasn't exactly a quiet entry because windows creak, doors creak. Anyone coming into the building after them would have made enough noise for them to hear it. But instead they are hearing the sounds of footfalls going across the floorboards above them towards the stairway where they first came down into the cellar. So moving to cut them off. The pair look at each other, and then in an instant they are both running up the stairs. They knock the candle over behind them. Don't worry, doesn't set anything on fire because it's a dirt floor. But they are up and out, and they run and they run. And finally, when they've reached what they feel is a safe distance away, they pause, they catch their breath, they turn to each other, and they look behind to see, am I being pursued by the apparition of, well, basically anything. There's no such thing as a good apparition at this point in time. And they're fine, so they look to one another, they debate the wisdom of going back for all of their gear, decide, no, we are not going to do that. So fast forward to the next spring, the landlords that own, so the agents of the patentees who own this piece of land are getting no revenue for it because there's no one on it paying rent. So they find a fellow named Dundee who has moved up from Long Island, and they rent it to him, conveniently forgetting to tell him about all of the weird stuff that happened there. Dundee's plan is not to run it as a tavern, but to set it up as a farmhouse and farm the land, which is kind of the default option during this period in time. So he moves in, he brings his family with him, he gets set up. Then he starts hearing these stories from the locals that, oh yeah, man, the place where you live is haunted. Like, people see the former proprietor all the time. He had all of this money. It was hidden somewhere. He killed all of these people. We don't know how many it was, but we're sure it was a lot. Those bodies are stashed somewhere. Have you seen any ghosts lately? And this guy's like, oh man, I've got a problem here, because if I tell my wife this, we are out. Like, she's not going to spend another night under this roof. There are no farms around to rent. Farming is what I do, so I'm just going to keep it on the DL, but I'm going to check out that cellar. So he goes down to the cellar, broad daylight, even though, it's not exactly windows out of an 18th century cellar. He's a little bit perplexed to find 2 coats and a pile of digging tools down there, as well as obvious signs that someone's been digging. So he thinks to himself, all right, probably one of these local guys, or 2, there are 2 coats here, have come in and looked for the treasure. Now that means that maybe it's a legit story about the treasure, but on the other hand, if I start digging for coins, I might end up like uncovering bones of a human nature, and that would be extremely unpleasant. So I'm just going to make all of this digging stuff disappear, and I'm not going to dig on this property, and no one will ever dig on this property. Now, meanwhile, our heroic friends, Payne and Squires, have just been sitting, metaphorically speaking, on the outside, waiting for this guy to either tell the locals, oh man, ghosts, or to just show up with a bunch of money and start throwing it around. And it's got to be one or the other. 3 months pass. The guy has sown his crops, he's beginning to do the first hay harvest, and they decide, we're going to go pay him a visit under the cover of, do you need any help bringing the hay in? So they show up, they exchange pleasantries at the hay barn, and Squires says, so, have you found any money by any chance? Just, general interest here, or perhaps have you seen the ghost? And the new farmer says, no, have no money, haven't found any, haven't seen any ghosts, thank God. But the weird thing is, I did find some clothes downstairs and these digging implements, and he shows Squires and Payne in the barn where he has hidden these, where he has placed these items. They, of course, immediately recognize their coats and the rest of their stuff, but decide that the wiser course of action is to just play dumb. Oh, wow, that's super weird. We don't know anyone who would have gone into that cellar to start digging stuff up. That's just crazy. The new farmer says, yes, that's good. Tell everyone, no digging here. So Squires and Payne go away. They disappear into the fog banks of history. The farmer continues to live and farm there for many, many years without encountering any difficulties, dies peacefully. So that is the story from Mr. Bailey. Now, the part that I find interesting, of course, has anyone here seen the Dead Files TV show? My wife is so pleased with that answer because I watch it, and she does not like it. I watch it though. The defense is because they pair a psychic with a local historian who has to find out if there is any actual documentation to support the story. Now, why would I be telling you that? Because unless I somehow turn this off, this is what happens when I talk for too long. The remote turns off. All right, we're going to have to resort to the super embarrassing it has this jammed entirely. Super embarrassing click there. It turns out that this story continues on in the telling in that area. So remember, 1874 is when Bailey's publishing, and he remarks at the end of this story, oh, well, you know, the memories and stories surrounding the haunted tavern are basically forgotten now. No one ever talks about them. Fast forward to 1954, when Helen Myers, one of the Pojo reporters, decides that she's going to go around collecting local stories. So she talks to this guy named Robert Kelly, who lives down in East Fishkill, and gets the story about the haunted tavern, which unfortunately was demolished in 1914, which is why we don't necessarily have a photo of it. I'm not sure that the really grainy photo in this scan, which is the best that we have, is actually of the building itself or not. Robert Kelly tells a story that's very much in keeping with the one I just told you adapted from Bailey. His twist on it all, though, if we go back to that peddler who disappeared, according to Kelly, the peddler's wife turns up looking for him, a woman named Mary, and she never leaves the area. She maintains that her husband was murdered by this guy. Nothing can ever be proven, so no action is ever taken against him. But nevertheless, she becomes a recluse in the area, has all sorts of craziness attached to her. But it is intriguing to see that we do at least have documentation of a story that's been told over several hundred years here in Dutchess County. So I think that's pretty cool. Yay! And the remote works again. Now our next story is one of witchcraft down in New Hackensack. So if you're like me, when the idea of witches come up, you think of a lovely seacoast town in Massachusetts called Salem, even though the Salem witchcraft trials happened in what is now Danvers, England, in 1692. The whole witchcraft thing in America, most of the coverage is in the 1600s. Most of it is from New England. New York isn't really established early enough to be the sort of place where you have women denounced as witches, you have juries, you have executions. That kind of stuff does not really happen around here. But there is a 19th century component to witchcraft. If any of you have heard the story of the Bell Witch, which is out in Tennessee, I believe. There is a tradition of storytelling about bewitchments that don't necessarily involve a woman or a man or some other person who is denounced as a witch. And we have, courtesy of Bailey, this story of witchcraft in Hackensack in 1786 at the home of Dr. Stephen Thorne. Why is there a photo of a door on this slide? That is because Dr. Stephen Thorne was a real person. His house was a real structure built around 1772. It was subsequently demolished in the 20th century, but the interior fittings, including this front door, were saved for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So another place where we have that sort of fuzzy line between fact and fiction. So taking it to 1786, one night Stephen Thorne decides, I'm going to go out with my wife, we're going to have a good time, some dinner with some friends of ours, no kids. I feel like many of the people here feel that vibe. So we're going to leave the kids at home with the maid servant, because clearly what could go wrong? Oh, famous last words. So the kids are home alone, well, they're home with the maid. And the maid decides, you know what, everyone needs snacks. Again, a vibe I think we can all feel. So she goes down into the cellar. Lots of these stories involve cellars, with the eldest daughter to get apples and walnuts, because the reason you have cellars in the 18th century is that's your cool, if not cold, storage. Now, while they are down there, suddenly, out of nowhere, I need to work on my special effects there. A horrendous knocking begins. Both of the women kind of freak out. Holy crap, what is this? Because it's not on a door, it's on the timbers right next to them. They flee upstairs, the knocking follows them. By the time Thorne and his wife return from their evening out, the entire household is in chaos. So Dr. Thorne's like, oh, this is clearly a trick. The kids have bribed the maid. Something's going on. So he does all sorts of experimenting to try to, unmask the hoax. So he identifies that, all right, the knocking is all around the maid. It's not any of the children. So I'm going to stand her here, I'm going to listen. The knocking, it just does not stop. It keeps going, a steady rap on a wooden surface. He goes down below her, so down into the cellar. The knocking is coming from upstairs where she is. He goes up to the floor above her. The knocking is coming down from is coming up from where she is. He moves her to rooms. The knocking follows her. It never stops. All night long. Knocking, 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 knocking. By the next morning, word is out in the community that the Thorne family has been bewitched. So visitors begin to arrive, and as the days go on, visitors begin coming from further and further away. First, they come from Poughkeepsie, which, in Dutchess County is like 3 or 4 days travel from anywhere else. Then they start coming up from Philadelphia, which is strangely only a day's travel. I don't know how that works. And finally then from New England. Hundreds of people come and visit the home, observe the phenomena, try all sorts of ways to debunk it. One of the examples given was 2 men grab a wide plank of wood, one on each end. They have the unnamed maid sit on the plank, and the knocking then starts coming from the plank. It's like we can see all of the hands involved in this situation. It doesn't look like human agency. Then Bailey's grandfather gets involved with this. So he comes in and he tests the girl. And one of the things that starts developing is, all right, every time she sits down to eat, forks, knives, spoons fly out of her hand, just across the room, they're gone. When she tries to reach for something on the table slides away from her, as though pulled or pushed by an invisible force. When she sits down, the knocking then moves to her chair, and if anyone sits down next to her, they and their chair are violently pushed away. So Bailey's grandfather sits down next to her, and for the period, he's a big man, 200 pounds. Like, yeah, Americans have changed a little over the intervening centuries. So he sits down, his chair is violently pushed away. And he's convinced, all right, clearly, this young woman has been bewitched. What is the logical response to finding a bewitched person? He offers Dr. Thorne, your household is all discombobulated by this bewitchment. Let me take this maid into my household, because what I really need is bewitchment. So this young woman goes with Bailey's grandfather to the house, and they discover, magically, miraculously, weirdly, that if Bailey's father, so the grandfather's son, if he places his hand on the young woman's forehead, knocking stops. Cold. Raises his hand, it's back. And if she's like laying in bed trying to have a nap, then he raises his hand, the knocking starts on the headboard. So this just follows her around. They can't get rid of it. And finally, even the Baileys have enough and say, all right, why don't you go back to live with your family? So she does. The knocking continues for years and years and years. Then finally, slowly slackens away and disappears. However, the bewitchment, bad luck, whatever you might want to call it, does not entirely go away. She makes 3 trips back to visit the Thorne home. The first time she visits, one of their cows disappears. Poof, gone. Second time she visits, a cow dies right in front of the family. Very expensive losses, both these things. But worst of all, time number 3, she shows up. And the colt, the young horse belonging to Dr. Thorne's eldest son, Now, this is not just a conveyance, it's a personal pet. Falls over and dies in front of the family, at which point the son says, "That's it. She shows up again, she is not being allowed in this house." She never does show up again. But according to Bailey, there are period newspaper accounts. I haven't been able to track them down yet, and he admitted he couldn't track them down in the period. You know, it's just you put the newspaper somewhere and he forgets where it went. But this is in line with other stories that we have in the early 19th century. Again, the Bell Witch being the craziest of them all, about bewitchment and witchcraft. But if you thought that that was the end of witches in Dutchess County, never fear. We have a story now that does not come from Bailey's work on local lore in the Fishkill area. This actually comes courtesy of the Dutchess County Historical Society in their 1948 volume, which was all about the town of Dover. And they made their annual pilgrimage. It's a day-long field trip that they used to do out to the town of Dover, where they hear local stories as well as local history. Now, if you go out to Dover today, you cannot see this structure. It is still there, though. This is the Sharperoon Furnace, because Dover, it's a very early settled part of Dutchess County. In fact, when the colonies of New York and Connecticut are trying to figure out where the border is going to be, they have their treaty negotiations in Dover, and that's where you get the Treaty of Dover in 1731 that creates the oblong. If you've ever looked at a map of the town of Northeast, or indeed the entire county, and you see that weird little like panhandle thing that's sticking up off the top, that's the oblong. It's a strip of land about 1 3/4 miles wide. It goes all the way down through Putnam into Westchester County. That was part of a land swap whereby we got that, we got Rye, and Connecticut got everything from Greenwich up through Stamford. That's the so-called horse neck or panhandle of Connecticut. So it settled early. It settled because there is so much iron out there. And they have an iron industry going from colonial times all the way up to the 1920s, when the Bessemer process is invented, and suddenly Pennsylvania takes the iron crown from everyone. So Sharperoon Furnace is a remnant of this iron industry. It's a blast furnace. It is used to melt the ore, the raw ore, down into something that can be refined. But where, I wonder, would a name like Sharperoon come from? Well, the story is, New Hackensack may have witchcraft, but Dover had an actual witch named Goody Sharperoon. Now, Goody is short for good wife. It was the 17th century term of address for a married woman. You don't necessarily see it used that much here in New York, partly because Puritans don't settle New York, partly because New York is settled later. However, Goody Sharperoon is operating in the Dover area, purportedly, in the early 18th century. Now, most witches, you know, we think of the hats, we think of the broomsticks, we think of the dances, we think of, you know, the book that Black Phillip is going to have you sign in exchange for butter and fancy dresses. If you don't understand that reference, watch The Witch, 2015, great movie, perfect for tomorrow night, especially if you want to scare trick-or-treaters. So here, though, Goody Sharperoon, there's no connection between her and the devil. It's so much weirder than that. Goody Sharperoon does not fly on a broomstick. She's well above and beyond that. Goody Sharperoon drives a chariot that is pulled by 2 bears. Yeah, not just bears, they are flying bears. It's not entirely clear, though, if they're actual, like, Superman flying, or if they can really jump a long distance. But the local story goes, there is on top of Chestnut Ridge a swamp called Bear Swamp. One day, Goody Sharperoon is driving along the western side of this ridge, and she decides, I want to go over this ridge and get into Dover proper for whatever business that witches may have to conduct over there. I do not meddle in the affairs of magic users. So she coaxes her bears to jump over Chestnut Ridge. They don't quite make it, though. So they land in the spot, and their landing is so heavy, they create an indentation that becomes what is today called Bear Swamp. and then they continue on their way. The next place that they land becomes Sharp Room, which is known as such before the blast furnace is set up. So with that, we are Owen. This is, again, a little bit of expansion on the documentation we have. The whole story, the documented story of Goody Sharp Room is this handful of sentences here. So blending the lines of history into folklore just a little bit. So with that, thank you all very much for being a wonderful audience. I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have. But we are more or less wrapped on the formal part of the program. So if you need to take that bathroom break, you need that 4th drink before you think about filling out our after-program survey, now's a beautiful time for that. Are there any questions? All right. Oh, one question.
I was there in 2016 when the sporting place.